What would you do if you saw three strangers on a billboard who looked exactly like the babies you gave up 17 years ago? They say a mother never forgets the sound of her child's first cry. But what if she chooses not to hear it? What if the very first moment her child breathes, she turns her back and walks away? In a cold delivery room under harsh fluorescent lights and sterile silence, a young woman lay trembling not just from labor pains but from the unbearable weight of a decision she would never stop carrying. Elena Carter gave birth to 3 daughters that night, 3 lives wrapped in cotton blankets and separated not by walls but by fear pressure and a silence she was told to maintain. She didn't hold them. She didn't name them. She simply signed her name on a document that erased her presence from their future. For 17 years, the world believed she moved on, that she chose fame over family image, over instinct. But the truth is, never that simple. Because while the cameras captured her beauty, her success, her red carpet smiles, her soul remained haunted by the cries she tried to forget. And when she sees their faces again, 3 young women strangers, and yet not standing tall on a billboard in the middle of the city, her heart shatters in ways no one could see. They looked exactly like her. They looked like what could have been, what should have been. This is not a story about perfection. It's not a story about clean redemption or easy forgiveness. It is about the quiet desperation of a woman who was told she couldn't be a mother who believed it, and who is now trying too late perhaps to rewrite even a fraction of the past. But can time forgive what love abandoned? Can 3 daughters find peace with the mother who never stayed yet, never truly left? What unfolds next is a journey of fractured identities, guarded hearts, and the uncertain fragile steps toward healing. Stay with us, because the story you're about to hear may be fiction, but its emotions, its pain, and its hope are as real as anything you've ever felt. And maybe within this story, you'll find a reflection of your own. She had given life to 3 daughters, and then vanished from theirs like a ghost no one wanted to remember. That thought hit Elena Carter with the force of a train as she stood still in the middle of a crowded cafe on a rainy Thursday afternoon, her fingers frozen around a lukewarm cup of coffee she had yet to sip. All around her life was moving baristas calling names, students tapping on laptops, couples laughing too loudly over overpriced croissants. But inside Elena, everything had stopped. The world blurred into meaningless noise as her eyes fixated on a magazine lying open on a table just a few feet away, abandoned by a hurried customer. The image on the glossy page wasn't just familiar, it was devastating. 3 young women poised in perfect symmetry, adorned in high-fashion gowns with an expression of fierce confidence stared back at her from the centerfold of a global fashion spread. They were stunning, powerful, iconic, and unmistakably hers. She didn't need a DNA test or a voice whispering confirmation. Elena knew. She knew in the marrow of her bones in the back of her throat that had gone dry in the way her knees buckled just slightly under the weight of recognition. Those were her daughters. The very children she had birthed and abandoned 17 years ago under a sterile hospital ceiling and the crushing judgment of her own mother. One had Elena's chin. Another carried the exact fleck of amber in her left iris. The third, God help her, smiled with the same asymmetrical lift Elena used to hate in the mirror until she grew into it. And yet here they were printed in ink and light, untouched by her absence thriving. Her heart thudded so loudly in her chest that she didn't notice when the barista called out her name. She didn't move, didn't breathe, because in that moment the past collided with the present in the cruelest way. She wasn't prepared. She thought she had made peace with her decision, that surrendering them had meant surrendering the ache too. But nothing could have readied her for seeing them like this. Not in a courtroom, not in a dream, and certainly not in a cafe she had ducked into for shelter from the rain. She wanted to look away but couldn't, wanted to cry, but her tears had all gone stiff from years of pretending not to miss what she never allowed herself to know. The woman she had become, an aging former model with calloused hands and empty mornings, felt suddenly transparent. Everyone in the cafe carried purpose, stories, futures. but she was only history, an untold chapter no one asked for. She took one slow step forward, then another, and reached out as if to touch the magazine. Her fingers hovered just above the page. She didn't flip it. Didn't dare. The page already said too much. Her girls were out in the world, radiant and whole, and she was just a shadow watching from the edge. That moment, silent searing, would follow her forever. It was supposed to be just another errand, an ordinary walk past department stores and neon-lit windows, another attempt to exist quietly in a world that had long moved on without her. Elena Carter tucked her scarf tighter against the cold breeze and passed by the massive display windows of Lexmore Plaza, barely glancing up until her steps slowed, then stopped altogether. There above the entrance to the city's most elite fashion house, a digital billboard sprang to life. It didn't shout. It whispered in color and movement, in memory. 3 girls stood side by side in a slow-motion fashion reel, wind catching their hair as they turned toward the camera. They didn't just look related. They looked replicated. Same heart-shaped faces, same piercing gaze, same subtle dimple that tugged at the right cheek when one of them smiled. And they looked like her. Exactly like her. The jawline Elena once modeled before motherhood was even a thought. The eyes her grandmother always said held too much sadness for a girl so young. The delicate fingers they lifted to adjust a strand of hair or tuck a hemline, it was as if someone had copied and pasted fragments of her onto 3 living, breathing beings. Elena staggered back a step, hand clutching the edge of a concrete pillar for balance. She wasn't hallucinating. She knew what she was seeing. The camera angle shifted, and now the girls walked down a minimalist runway dressed in sleek satin blacks and pearl whites. The name Lumina glowing beneath them in bold typography. A voiceover called them the future of fashion. The crowd beyond the camera roared in admiration. But all Elena could hear was the echo of a delivery room years ago, the sterile clang of instruments, the pressure of a pen being pressed into her hand, and the voice of her mother saying, "Sign it. This is for the best, the best." For whom she had spent nearly 2 decades convincing herself she did the right thing, that giving them up meant giving them a better life. And now here they were, so achingly alive and present faces plastered across 10 stories of glass and steel. But to the world, Elena was no one, not listed, not thanked, not missed. She pressed a hand against the cool glass of the storefront, not even noticing how ridiculous she must look, just a woman in a gray coat staring too long at a screen. Her reflection merged with the footage. In that moment, it was like 4 of them stood there, not 3. The 4th. The one who had disappeared before names were given, before birthdays were celebrated, before lullabies turned into albums. And then it hit her they didn't know. They had no idea who she was. These weren't reunions in motion. This wasn't fate bringing them back together. This was a silent collision between past and future, and she was the only one who felt it. The world saw rising stars. Elena saw the daughters she left behind. The paintbrush slipped from her fingers before she even registered that her hand had gone numb. One moment, Elena Carter was standing at the back corner of her tiny apartment, staring at the unfinished portrait she had been working on for weeks. 3 silhouettes deliberately faceless, reaching toward a light they could never quite touch. The next moment her vision blurred. Her knees gave out and she collapsed onto the wooden floor with a thud that echoed through the silence like a gunshot. The glass jar of water tipped over, spilling a pale blue tide across the canvas, swallowing every tentative outline she had dared to draw. Her breath came in short, disoriented gasps. The image from the billboard wouldn't stop replaying in her mind, 3 faces identical to one another. And to her. How many years had passed since that day, 1718? Long enough that the girls she had brought into the world were now women luminous and bold, elevated to icons, while she had receded into obscurity. The air turned thick, the room closed in, and in the space between consciousness and collapse, her mind tore itself open and flooded with memory. She was back in the hospital room, the smell of antiseptic, the flicker of harsh fluorescent lights. her body still trembling from the birth, still stitched with pain. But it wasn't the physical ache that undid her. It was the silence. No one celebrated. No one held her hand. Her mother, impeccably dressed in cream wool and pearls, stood in the corner like a silent judge. Her arms crossed her mouth, pursed in disapproval. "You've done the right thing," her voice had whispered, sharp and cold. "You don't want your name tied to a scandal. You're 19, Elena. You have a career ahead of you, not a crib." The nurses barely looked her in the eye. They wrapped the babies quickly, efficiently, as if time itself were impatient. Elena had begged to hold them just once, but her mother intercepted the request, her manicured hand resting on the adoption documents. "No," she said, as if speaking for everyone. "This is best." Elena remembered reaching out anyway, catching just a glimpse of 3 wriggling forms, each one letting out a cry so thin, so sharp, it cut through bone. One of them had a tuft of black hair. Another had clenched fists. The third, the smallest, had opened her eyes, and Elena swore she saw recognition. Or maybe it was just desperation. She had stitched a tiny cloth bracelet, white thread on soft cotton with the initial E sewn carefully into the lining. She had slipped it into one of the swaddles, hoping, praying that one of them would keep it, that someone someday would find it and ask questions. But questions were dangerous back then. Love was inconvenient, and motherhood for someone like her was unforgivable. Back in the present, Elena lay on the floor, her chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. Her eyes focused on the ceiling, then drifted back to the ruined painting soaked in blue. The silhouette faces were gone, lost in the water. It didn't matter. She didn't need a canvas anymore to see their faces. They were out there, living, breathing, shining, and now she could no longer pretend they weren't. The past had come for her, dressed in lights and beauty, and she had dropped her brush. Not just out of shock, but because it was time to remember everything. It started with a box. Not the kind meant to hold secrets, but the kind that always ends up in the back of every closet, taped shut, with no label, waiting to be forgotten. Angela had only been looking for an old pair of boots. That day, the power was out in the apartment, and boredom had driven her into a cleaning frenzy. She pulled down sweaters, scarves, even a faded tutu from her childhood dance recital, until her hand touched the corner of a cardboard edge, soft with age. Curious, she tugged the box free, sneezing as a cloud of dust erupted. Most of the contents were exactly what she expected: baby pictures, a hospital bracelet with the name Angela 3 LBS 8, Oz, a stuffed bear missing one eye. But beneath those, flattened at the bottom like it didn't want to be found, was a folded document yellowing at the edges. Angela opened it slowly. It was her birth certificate, or so she thought. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Her name, the city hospital in rural Oregon. Her father's name, Tom Barrett, typed in blocky print. But then she saw the date. Not her birthday. A full 6 weeks later. Her hands froze. That couldn't be right. She flipped it over, scanned for corrections, amendments, anything to explain the inconsistency. But it was official. Stamped. Registered. Authenticated. And suddenly, a cold sensation crept up her spine. For 17 years she had celebrated her birthday, on March 9th. But this certificate listed April 20th. It wasn't just a typo. It was a different event, a different timeline, a different truth. Angela sat down hard on the carpet, the paper trembling in her hands. Her heart thudded against her ribs in slow, booming beats. She pulled out her phone and checked her adoption records, which Tom had given her years ago, in a gesture of openness he'd always promised. The paperwork there listed March 10th, the day after what she'd always believed was her birth. A direct adoption, private and sealed like thousands of others. But if the birth certificate was correct, she hadn't been adopted the next day. She'd been adopted over a month after she was born. Which begged the question, where had she been for 6 weeks? She stared at the date, a single line that now split her identity like a crack in glass. If there was a lie in the timeline, what else had been hidden? Were the sisters really her biological siblings? Had there been another woman in the shadows, someone who gave birth then vanished? Angela suddenly remembered a dream she used to have as a child of a faceless woman, standing at the end of her bed, watching, not speaking, just watching, with a sadness too large to explain. She had always dismissed it as imagination. Now she wasn't so sure. The light flickered back on. The hum of the refrigerator startled her, but the silence inside her chest remained. She picked up the stuffed bear and stared at its missing eye. Had someone given this to her? Someone before Tom? Before everything? She refolded the certificate and placed it back inside the box, but this time she didn't put the box away. She set it by her desk within reach, as if daring herself to ask the questions she wasn't ready to answer. Truth once uncovered has a way of echoing, and for the first time in her life, Angela was beginning to hear it. Not loud, not clear, but steady. The past wasn't behind her, it was beginning to breathe again, and it started with a date that didn't match. Angela didn't confront anyone, not yet. She didn't throw the birth certificate on the kitchen table or demand answers in a storm of emotion. Instead, she folded the document with clinical precision and slipped it into her journal behind a drawing she'd once made of her and her sisters, holding hands beneath a tree that had no roots. That night, while her sisters scrolled through their phones and Tom cooked pasta in the kitchen humming a Sinatra tune, Angela sat in silence, eyes fixed on the steam curling from her plate, but tasting nothing. Her mind was turning, rewinding, rearranging memories like puzzle pieces that never quite fit until now. She waited until the house was quiet, until the dishwasher had stopped humming and Tom's bedroom door clicked shut, then pulled out her laptop and began to search. Oregon birth records, 2005. Private adoptions. Hospital registration anomalies. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, just that something didn't add up. The dates, the silence, the missing 6 weeks. She traced forums for adoptees, read blogs from women who'd placed children for adoption, and later tried to reconnect, sifted through 100 versions of a similar pain. Then she remembered the box in Tom's study. He had kept everything: tax records, legal documents, even receipts from grocery stores 10 years old. Maybe he kept copies of the adoption agreement. She waited 3 days. Then when Tom left for his usual Sunday hike, she unlocked his office with the spare key taped beneath the hallway table. The file cabinet creaked. Third drawer down, Angela Barrett in black marker. There, tucked among social worker reports and medical records, was a thin envelope marked "Confidential." Original birth record. Her hands trembled as she slid it open. Inside was a single-page discharge notes from the hospital signed by someone named E. Carter. No first name, no address, just the initial and a scrawl of a signature. Angela stared at it. Her chest felt tight, as if her lungs had been packed with questions instead of air. E. Carter. That was not a name she recognized. Not Tom's. Not anyone's from the family photos that lined the living room walls. For a moment she considered snapping a photo of the document with her phone, but something in her gut told her not yet. She returned everything exactly as it was closed. The drawer relocked the office and walked out with a new weight behind her ribs. Over the next week, she watched Tom more closely, how his eyes lingered on family pictures, how he flinched slightly whenever she mentioned anything about the past, how his voice softened when he said her name as if it belonged to someone else before it belonged to her. She began searching for E. Carter. She combed through alumni directories, art association records, and public archives. Nothing concrete, but then on a forgotten online exhibition catalog she found it. E. Carter, mixed media works on abandonment and loss. The words pierced like ice. The artist had held a solo show 15 years ago at a community center just 2 towns away. Angela clicked the thumbnail of the artwork. It was abstract, 3 small figures in shadow with a 4th just outside the frame reaching. The caption read, "What I Left Behind." Her hand hovered over the mouse. Something inside her, something old and frightened and furious, stirred awake. If this artist was who she suspected, if this was not just a coincidence, then her story wasn't a closed book. It was a chapter ripped out and hidden. And Angela was done being written by someone else's silence. Quietly, precisely, and with a resolve sharpened by years of unanswered questions, she began to write her own version. One search, one name, one broken truth at a time. Angela hadn't planned to enter the gallery. It was just a detour, a whim, while she waited for her coffee order at a sleepy little cafe nestled between a flower shop and a vintage bookstore on the edge of town. The sign above the gallery door read, Silver Fern Studio, Local Artists' Eternal Stories. Something about that tagline made her pause. She stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of varnish and old wood. It was quiet, almost reverent, like entering a chapel. The space was small, white walls, low ceilings, soft instrumental music playing in the background. Angela wandered past landscapes and abstract pieces, nothing remarkable at first. Then at the far end of the room, just beside the exit to the back garden, her eyes locked onto a single painting. She stopped breathing. It was her face. Not a version of her. Not a look-alike. Not someone similar. Her. At 17, or rather the her she would have been if someone had painted her in secret, capturing the tilt of her head, the faint curve of her left eyebrow, the exact shade of storm gray in her eyes. The portrait wasn't glossy or fashionable. It was raw, textured, painted with a trembling kind of urgency. Her hair was down loose waves cascading over bare shoulders, and there was a vulnerability in the way her arms wrapped around herself as if the artist had caught her mid-thought, mid-heartbreak. The name on the plaque beneath read, Girl in the Quiet Hour, 2007, E. Carter. Her heart thudded once, then again. E. Carter, the same name from the discharge records. Her mother. Could it be? The painting was dated exactly 17 years ago, matching the time of her birth. Angela's hands began to shake. She looked around, suddenly self-conscious, but the gallery attendant was busy speaking to a couple at the front. She leaned in closer. The brushstrokes were uneven in places, some areas blurred with what looked like water damage or tears. Angela could feel it in her gut. This was not just a painting. It was a confession, a memory, a message, a timeline scrambled in color and oil. She snapped a quick photo, then another. She searched for more by the same artist, but this was the only E. Carter piece on the walls. The rest were from different names, different styles. She walked to the front desk, voice steady but strained. Hi, this painting at the back. Girl in the Quiet Hour, do you know anything about the artist? The young woman behind the desk tilted her head. That one's been here for years. The artist dropped it off for a local charity exhibit in 2010 and never came back to reclaim it. We reached out, but the contact info was old. She moved, I think. Haven't heard from her since. Do you have any records? Angela pressed, forcing calm into her voice. Maybe an address, a phone number. The attendant hesitated. Sorry, we're not allowed to share personal information, but I can tell you she signed the guest book that day. You're welcome to look. Angela flipped through the dusty ledger. Page after page of looping cursive and doodled hearts. Then near the bottom of the 2010 section she found it, Elena Carter. Thank you for giving Forgotten Faces a voice. The handwriting was elegant, familiar in a haunting way. Angela stared at the name, her pulse rising in her throat. The painting wasn't just art. It was a breadcrumb. Proof that someone had remembered her not in abstract guilt, but in deliberate, painstaking brushstrokes. She stepped out of the gallery photo, clutched tight on her phone, and felt the air shift around her. The past wasn't lost. It had just been waiting to be seen. And now the portrait in the quiet hour had finally found its voice. It had happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the gray outside seemed to seep into every corner of the house, making even the warmest lamp feel dim. Angela had been 6. Lila and Madison, just barely older, each curled on the floor with crayons and mismatched socks, humming to a cartoon playing faintly on the TV. Tom wasn't home. The front door had creaked open and shut with the rhythm of a woman who moved like she was always on the edge of breaking something or someone. Diane, Tom's then-wife, their adoptive mother, stood over the kitchen counter with a letter in her hand. It had arrived in a plain white envelope. No return address, just the slightly crooked typewritten name, To the Daughters of Elena Carter. She hadn't meant to let them see it, but curiosity got the better of her. She slit the envelope open, with the bread knife skimmed the content, and something in her face hardened. Angela, small and unsuspecting, had wandered in just as Diane read the last lines out loud under her breath. I don't ask for forgiveness. I only hope one day they'll know I never stopped loving them. The paper trembled in Diane's grip. Angela had asked innocently, Who's Elena? Diane didn't answer. Instead, she turned slowly, the letter now crumpled in her palm like a piece of trash too dangerous to exist. Without a word, she marched to the fireplace in the living room, fed the letter into the low flame like a priest offering a cursed relic, and watched it curl into ash. The girls never knew what was written. That night, Diane had sat them down, Angela still clutching her stuffed rabbit, Madison glaring as always, and Lila with eyes wide and uncertain, and spoke in a voice so steady it left no room for question. Your birth mother died in an accident years ago. There's nothing left to find, nothing to remember. I am your only mother now. Understand? The way she said it didn't leave space for grief, only silence, and that silence became law. Over time, the girls stopped asking. Tom never knew about the letter Diane had burned the envelope to, and any trace of Elena's return had vanished before it could root itself in their lives. But the lie never quite sat still in Diane's conscience. She carried it like a splinter under her skin, never enough to break her, but enough to make her wince when no one was looking. She had married Tom not long after he adopted the girls, believing they would build a clean life together, free of shadows. But Elena's name haunted her like a ghost. She couldn't banish a name she couldn't compete with, no matter how many bedtime stories she read or birthday cakes she baked. Diane wasn't cruel by nature. She was a woman who feared replacement, who saw motherhood as something to be earned, defended, and if needed, protected by deception. To her, Elena was not a person. She was a threat, a phantom from the past who had abandoned the very children Diane had fought to raise. But the truth, as truths do, refused to stay buried. Years later, long after Diane and Tom had separated, and after the girls had grown into women with questions too sharp to ignore, the memory of that rainy afternoon returned to Angela. Not as a full recollection, but as a flicker, a moment when she'd seen a letter burned, a name whispered, a look in Diane's eyes that felt too much like fear. And fear always hides something. When Angela finally confronted Diane, older, bolder, her voice steady with quiet accusation, Diane didn't deny it. She only said, I did what I thought was best. I was trying to protect you. But protect from what? From love. From a mother who made mistakes but wanted to return. Angela didn't say another word. She just walked away, the silence between them now heavier than it had ever been. Elena's truth had nearly been erased with a single flame, but the ashes never left. And now the daughters who were told their mother had died began to unearth what had been taken, one memory, one lie, one lost letter at a time. Diane had always been a woman of control, meticulous, calculating, and fiercely protective of what she considered hers. From the moment she moved into the old Victorian house Tom had inherited, she viewed everything inside it as an extension of her own design, the decor, the discipline, the children, especially the children. To the outside world, she was the image of maternal grace. Her tailored cardigans, punctual PTA appearances, and carefully curated social media posts suggested nothing but a composed woman devoted to motherhood. But beneath the surface was a storm of insecurity, particularly when it came to the girls. Angela, Madison, and Lila were never born from her body, but that didn't stop Diane from needing them to see her as the only mother that mattered. She made their lunches with handwritten notes, sewed Halloween costumes late into the night, and clapped the loudest at every recital. But none of that erased the fact that she came after, that once there was someone else. And the thought of that, someone, the mysterious Elena Carter, gnawed at Diane's soul like a shadow she could never fully erase. When the first whisper of Elena appeared in the form of a hospital record left behind in a stack of legal documents, Diane's hands had trembled as she read it. Just a name, a date, a mother, biological. It felt like acid seeping into her perfect portrait of motherhood. Diane knew from that moment she couldn't allow the girls to know. It wasn't just fear, it was jealousy. A bone-deep, suffocating jealousy that twisted her stomach whenever Lila hummed to herself while sketching, or Madison instinctively defended her sisters, or Angela curled into Tom's side like a child seeking comfort. These weren't behaviors they learned from Diane. These were echoes, personality traits passed on from someone Diane had never met, but already despised. What if the girls saw themselves in Elena? What if one letter, one visit, one revelation was enough to make them long for someone who had abandoned them? That thought was unbearable. It would mean Diane wasn't enough. That all her sacrifices, all her years, all the ways she tried to mold herself into the role of mother could be undone in an instant by a woman who had left. That fear metastasized into control. She tightened curfews, monitored conversations, intercepted mail. When a postcard arrived from Santa Fe signed simply, E. Diane didn't even flinch. She ripped it in half before the girls came home. When Tom asked about it later, curious not suspicious, Diane dismissed it as junk mail. He believed her. He always did. But the power wasn't just in what she destroyed, it was in what she constructed. She wove a narrative so carefully that even the girls began to believe it, that their biological mother had died in childbirth, that Diane had stepped in like an angel to rescue them from a cruel fate. She didn't need to be cruel, only consistent. Every bedtime story, every family photo, every silent reinforcement of her version of the past was a brick in the wall she built around them. It wasn't hatred that drove her, it was the terror of being dethroned, of losing the singular identity she clung to most, mother. And deep down, Diane knew it was fragile. Her love for the girls wasn't false, but it was possessive. It demanded loyalty, silence, and compliance. She couldn't risk them asking questions, because questions led to answers, and answers led to Elena. In her quietest moments, when the girls were out and the house echoed with absence, Diane would sit in the kitchen clutching a wine glass with trembling fingers and imagine what it would be like if they discovered the truth. She could already see it: Angela's cold disappointment, Madison's rage, Lila's wounded eyes. She couldn't survive that. So she buried the truth. Not just from them, but from herself. Told herself Elena didn't matter, that the girls were better off, that lies told in love were not lies at all. But lies grow roots, and as the girls grew older, more curious, more independent, those roots began to crack through the surface of Diane's carefully manicured life. And one day, when truth finally bloomed, ugly, raw, undeniable, Diane would realize that control built on fear is not love. And motherhood cannot be hoarded. It must be earned or lost. The first time Diane laid eyes on Elena Carter in person, the air was thick with tension, so sharp it could cut skin. It was a cold Tuesday morning years ago, long before the girls became public figures, long before the name Carter meant anything to them. Diane had just picked up the girls from their preschool art class when she noticed a woman standing at the far end of the parking lot, thin and pale fingers clutching a worn scarf like it was the last thread tethering her to the earth. Elena didn't speak. She just stood there, her eyes locked onto the girls, wide and watery with something between awe and devastation. At first, Diane didn't even recognize her, just another stranger lingering a bit too long. But then their eyes met. And in that moment, something ancient and instinctual surged in Diane's chest, the awareness of territory being trespassed, of a bond being threatened. She marched straight toward Elena without hesitation, her heels pounding against the asphalt like gunfire. "Don't," Diane said coldly, standing only inches away, her breath visible in the winter air. "Don't you dare come near them again." Elena opened her mouth just slightly, as if to form a word, maybe a plea, maybe an apology, but Diane raised her hand, not to strike, but to signal finality. "You don't get to stand here and watch them like you have some right. You gave them up. You signed the papers. You walked away. You don't get to haunt the edges of their lives like some tragic ghost hoping they'll run into your arms someday. You are not their mother. I am." Elena's lips quivered, but no sound came out. Her hands trembled so violently she had to clasp them together just to keep from falling apart. But Diane wasn't done. Her voice dropped lower, colder, with venom buried in every syllable. "I swear to God, if you ever show up again, if I ever see your face anywhere near them, I will file for a restraining order so fast you won't even get a second glance. And I will tell them exactly who you are. I will tell them that the woman trying to sneak into their lives now is the same one who didn't even bother to hold them when they were born. That was the dagger." Diane saw the way Elena flinched at those words, like they cut through flesh, not just pride. But Diane didn't relent. She leaned in even closer and hissed, "You are the past, and I will not let you ruin their future." And just like that, she turned on her heel and walked away, gathering the girls into her SUV like a lioness shielding her cubs. Elena didn't follow. She didn't cry out. She simply faded back into the shadows, a silence that felt heavier than any scream. Diane never told Tom. She never mentioned the encounter to anyone. But she made sure every address was updated, every school form double-checked, every emergency contact line drawn so tight that no outside name could ever slip through. She became the gatekeeper, not just of the girls' lives, but of the version of truth she was determined to preserve. And every now and then, especially on birthdays when the girls asked innocent questions, "Did our birth mom ever try to see us? Or do you think she remembers us?" Diane would smile tightly and lie through her teeth. She never came back, not once. But in the deep corners of her mind, she always saw Elena's face, pale, hollow, defeated. And though she told herself it was for the best, that she had protected the girls from confusion and pain some nights, the memory twisted in her chest like a splinter. Because even if she had succeeded in keeping Elena away, she had also kept something else out, the possibility of healing the chance for a truth that didn't have to destroy. But Diane never allowed doubt. Not then. Not when power still felt like protection and threats like safety. Because to her, motherhood wasn't something to share. It was something to defend, at any cost. It started with a question, quiet but sharp, slipping from Angela's lips like a blade in velvet. "Why didn't you ever tell us Tom was seated at the kitchen table?" Morning light slicing through the window blinds, his hands trembling slightly as he set down the mug of lukewarm coffee. He didn't answer right away. He didn't know how. Across from him, Madison stood with arms crossed, jaw clenched so tightly it pulsed beneath her skin. Aubrey hovered near the door, eyes flitting between her sisters like a witness, unsure if she belonged to the prosecution or the defense. "We asked you." Angela pressed louder this time, voice laced with a betrayal she hadn't fully processed yet. "We asked you about her. You always said there was nothing to know." Tom exhaled a sound more like surrender than breath. "I thought I was protecting you," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they fell flat. From what Madison snapped. From the truth. From the fact that the woman who gave birth to us didn't die like she said. Angela's hands slammed the table. Diane lied. You let her control the story of our lives." Why Tom's eyes filled with something ancient, remorse and confusion and the weight of years built on silence. "Because I was afraid that if you knew, you'd want her, and I didn't know how to share you." Aubrey spoke then softly but firmly. "You were never supposed to share us. You were supposed to give us the truth and let us choose." Later that day, Diane arrived, summoned by a message Madison had sent, brief and cold. "You owe us an explanation." She walked in like she still belonged, like the house hadn't aged, like the girls were still small enough to be held in one hand and silenced with the other. But the air shifted when Angela stepped forward, holding up the torn envelope, Elena's first letter never delivered. "This was hers," she said. "You took it from us." Diane's face remained stoic, but her voice betrayed her. "I did what I had to do. That woman abandoned you. She didn't deserve. She tried." Aubrey interrupted, her voice like ice. "You made sure she couldn't." "You lied," Madison added, stepping closer. "And then you raised us to believe our story was whole when it was broken from the start." Diane turned to Tom, searching for reinforcement, but he didn't rise. He didn't defend her, and the silence was louder than anything else. But it wasn't just the adults. That night, in the stillness of their shared apartment, the real fracture surfaced, not from parents, but from within. Angela stared out the window while Madison paced and Aubrey sat cross-legged on the couch, arms wrapped around herself. "You knew, didn't you?" Madison asked Angela without turning. "Before all this, you suspected." Angela didn't answer at first. Then in a whisper, "I did. But I was scared to be right." Madison laughed bitterly. "You always do that. Keep things to yourself. Play the lone soldier. Because you take over everything," Angela snapped. "You decide what's right, what's moral, who's worthy of what. Like you're some damn judge." And you, Madison fired back, pretend to be the golden child while hiding behind your sketchbooks. You want answers, but you don't want the mess that comes with them. Enough, Aubrey said, voice trembling. We're doing exactly what they did. Lying, guarding, breaking apart. Silence fell again, thick and heavy. And in that moment they realized the truth hadn't just broken their past, it was threatening their present. But unlike Diane or Tom, they still had time. To talk, to fight, to choose. Not just what they believed, but who they wanted to be. And whether or not Elena was part of that, well, that decision hadn't yet been made. But the story, for once, belonged to them. The lights were blinding, the kind that didn't just illuminate beauty, but demanded performance, merciless, probing, relentless. The runway show was at its peak, a culmination of months of preparation, design, and corporate pressure. Madison stood backstage, her heart pounding in rhythm with the pulsing music. Her dress shimmered in every color imaginable, the crowd beyond the curtain, a blur of flashing cameras and curated applause. The fashion house's logo floated mid-air in holographic grandeur, a symbol of success, power, and glossy narratives. But beneath the glamour, something was breaking. As her name was called, she stepped onto the catwalk, not as a model, not as a muse, but as a daughter with a truth too long buried. She walked with precision, each step a silent rebellion, each movement carved from a mixture of fury and grace. When she reached the end of the runway, instead of striking the final pose, she turned toward the audience and took the mic from the stunned host. A hush fell over the room like a dropped veil. She looked at the crowd, not at the designers or influencers or executives, but directly into the lenses of every camera she could see. Her voice, when it broke, the silence was clear and raw and irreversibly human. Tonight, she began, you came to see a fashion show. You expected perfection, symmetry, and stories sewn into fabric. But I have my own story to tell, one that wasn't stitched into any of these garments, but written into my blood. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Her hands didn't shake, though her heart did. I'm not just a model. I'm not just a face you frame with lights or a name printed on magazines. I am the daughter of a woman who was erased, deleted from every page of my life, as if her existence was inconvenient. The silence was sharp now. No applause. No cameras clicked. Only the hum of 100 breaths held too long. Her name, Madison continued, was Elena Carter. You won't find her name in my biography. You won't hear it in interviews. Because someone decided that her past disqualified her from being my mother. Because fear, control, and lies made it easier to pretend she never existed. But she did. She does. And I'm tired of pretending otherwise. At that, her voice caught not with weakness, but with the weight of 17 years buried under silence. I don't stand here for sympathy. I stand here because the truth matters. Because I'm more than a brand. More than a lookbook. More than a perfect silhouette in someone else's fantasy. I'm a girl who cried herself to sleep, wondering why something felt missing even when everything looked perfect. And now I know it was her. It was always her. The cameras resumed, not clicking, but recording now. Live feeds blinked green. The show producer gestured frantically from the sidelines, but no one interrupted. Madison looked down, then back up, her gaze locking with someone in the back row. She couldn't be sure, but it looked like Elena. Older, thinner heartbreak drawn across her face like fine-lined ink, but unmistakably real. Their eyes held each other in silence. To every girl who's ever been told to hide her pain behind beauty, Madison said louder now, and to every mother who was told she wasn't enough, I see you. I am you. And tonight I take back the name that was taken from me. She didn't drop the mic. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She stood still, letting the silence wrap around her like armor. The lights didn't dim, the crowd didn't cheer, but somewhere in that breathless pause, a truth finally stood on its own 2 feet. The fashion world may have come for spectacle. What they got was something they didn't know they needed, a girl not performing, but remembering and reclaiming. The world didn't just hear her words, it absorbed them like a shockwave radiating out from that quiet, pointed moment on the runway, and bursting through every screen, every post, every whispered conversation. Within minutes, the video of Madison's impromptu speech had been clipped, edited, reposted, and subtitled in over a dozen languages. Social media didn't just react, it ignited. On Twitter, hashtags like No Elena Carter, Yai, Nai, Yai, Daughter, of Erased Women and Truth on. The runway climbed trending charts with dizzying speed. Comment sections exploded beneath fashion reels and industry posts that had previously celebrated the night for its aesthetic brilliance. Now those same posts were flooded with demands for accountability, compassion, and above all, answers. TikTok users stitched her moment into countless videos, some with tears, others with stunned silence, many with their own stories of erasure, of adoption, of maternal absence. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a mirror reflecting back 1,000 private wounds onto the public stage. People who had never heard of Madison before that night now called her brave. Influencers who had smiled beside her on the carpet deleted their photos, uncertain whether they'd supported a manufactured narrative. Fashion critics who had praised the symmetry of her walk now wrote long-form essays dissecting the asymmetry of truth in curated industries. Celebrities reposted the video, adding captions like, "This is real beauty," and "Not all stories wear sequins." But not all reactions were kind. Some accused her of hijacking the moment for drama. Anonymous accounts surfaced, suggesting that models should model, not moralize. But those voices were quickly drowned in the tidal wave of empathy. Women across generations wrote in the comments, "I never knew my mother either. My foster parents told me mine died too. Thank you for saying what I never could." On Instagram, Madison's following doubled overnight, then tripled. She didn't post anything new. Just one silent story. A black screen with the words, "She existed," underneath a single heart emoji. That post alone was shared over 500,000 times. News outlets scrambled to catch up. Morning shows invited psychologists, adoption advocates, feminist historians. Was this an isolated story or a symptom of something larger? They dissected Elena's name, her past, the timeline. Old modeling photos of Elena resurfaced side by side with current shots of Madison and her sisters. The resemblance was haunting. One tabloid tried to sensationalize it. Abandoned and beautiful, the secret mother of fashion's rising stars. But it backfired. Readers called it exploitative. Instead, think pieces emerged titled, "When Silence is Louder Than Style and the Power of a Name Unspoken." Paparazzi camped outside modeling agencies, the Carter residence, even the old orphanage where the girls had once lived. But the girls themselves stayed quiet, no new interviews, no follow-ups. Their silence became its own message. They didn't owe the world more pain to consume. Meanwhile, inside homes across the country, conversations ignited between mothers and daughters, foster parents and children, even within communities that rarely spoke about abandonment, grief, or the complexities of womanhood stripped of choice. Teachers discussed it in class. Youth shelters used the clip as a conversation starter. Advocacy groups cited it in policy talks. It was no longer just a fashion story, it had become a cultural reckoning. Elena, watching it all unfold from the dim light of her modest apartment, felt no vindication, only a quiet ache. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't posted. But her name was everywhere, Elena Carter, the woman erased. In a cafe across the city, a girl whispered to her mother, "Would you ever give me away?" And the mother, caught in the glow of a phone screen replaying Madison's face, whispered back, "Never. And if I ever had, I would have done anything to be forgiven." Somewhere in that vast digital noise, a single post stood out. It was a repost of Madison's speech with the caption, "She didn't reclaim her story to punish. She reclaimed it to remember." And for a brief moment, in a world addicted to speed and spectacle, millions paused, not to judge, not to consume, but to feel. The story of one erased woman had somehow become the anthem for many. Elena stood at the edge of the abandoned train platform, the city lights behind her flickering like memories trying to stay alive. She clutched her coat tighter, not against the cold, but against the weight of everything she carried inside. Somewhere across this city, her daughters walked through glamorous hallways, flashed across screens and magazine covers their lives, unfolding like fairy tales, rewritten by strangers. And she remained the footnote that no one ever read aloud. Her breath caught as the echo of the past began to creep in, uninvited but relentless. She was back in that delivery room, the fluorescent lights humming above her like indifferent gods casting a pale sheen over her sweat-drenched face. She remembered the sterile smell of antiseptics, the cold touch of steel instruments, and the rhythmic beeping of the monitor that did not care. She was alone. Her mother had stood like a statue in the corner, arms crossed, voice smooth but chilling. "You know this is the only way, Elena. No one wants a broken woman with 3 babies. No gentle hands held hers, no soothing voices welcomed life into the world." And then came the cries 1, 2, 3 like the sound of her heart breaking in triplicate. She hadn't even gotten to hold them. Just a blur of movement, a clipboard, a pen, and her own trembling hand signing a document that screamed louder than any birth pang, "I give up my rights." Her only act of defiance was the tiny cloth bracelet she had stitched herself embroidered with the letter E, slipped around the wrist of the smallest child when no one was looking. It was her way of whispering, "I was here. I loved you." But time is a cruel wind. It erodes even the most desperate traces of love if they are left unprotected. In the years that followed, Elena wrote letters, dozens of them. Some long, some brief, all soaked with apology and longing. "I don't want to disrupt your life," she wrote once. "I only wish to know that you are safe." She sent them through the agency through channels that promised confidentiality, but offered no promises of delivery. Months passed, then years. No replies ever came. She checked her mailbox like a ritual, her fingers trembling over envelopes that always belonged to someone else. Eventually, she stopped checking. The silence was louder than rejection. It was erasure. And still her mind returned to those days. She remembered sitting by the window during rainstorms, watching droplets slide down the glass, imagining they were her daughter's fingers pressed against the other side. She remembered folding each letter with care as if the paper itself might carry a mother's scent, a trace of her love, a plea that might cross time and resentment. But no echo ever returned. Now on this platform she whispered their names under her breath, not their current names which she had seen on magazine spreads, but the names she had once whispered in the hospital room when no one else listened. Names she had never spoken aloud again. Names that felt like prayers folded inside grief. She reached into her pocket and felt the edge of another letter she'd written just last week. Not to send, just to write. Because writing was the only form of motherhood still allowed to her. She read the last lines in her head. "Maybe one day you'll ask why I left. Maybe you'll never want to know. But if you ever wonder if I cared, look for the silence. It's full of my love." The wind howled across the tracks and she turned her face into it. There were no witnesses here, no cameras, no judgment. Just a woman whose love had nowhere to go and memories that refused to fade. The past didn't just live inside her, it ruled her. And yet despite it all, she stood. Because standing was what you did when sitting meant collapsing. Because remembering them was all she had left. Tom sat at the edge of the porch, his weathered hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that had long since gone cold. The evening air was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed in, like guilt refusing to be ignored. He looked out at the garden, the one he'd built for the girls when they were small, planting sunflowers because they used to giggle at how tall they grew, reaching for the sky like hope. He heard footsteps behind him. Aubrey stood at the threshold, not saying anything, just waiting. Tom didn't look at her, not yet. His voice when it came was low and slow, like a man walking barefoot across shards of his own choices. "I knew she was alive," he said. The words floated into the night and didn't come back. "I knew Elena never died. I found out a few months after we brought you girls home." He took a breath heavy with rust and memory. The agency slipped up. A social worker quit. Documents got rerouted. And there it was in plain black ink. Elena Carter. No death certificate, no official closure, just a woman who disappeared. He rubbed his temples, ashamed. I should have said something. I should have told you. But you were still learning to sleep through the night without crying, still flinching at every unfamiliar voice, still asking why no one came back for you. I couldn't bear to tell you that someone had, that someone was alive, and chose to vanish. He turned to face her now. Aubrey's expression was unreadable, part shock, part something deeper, maybe betrayal, maybe understanding, maybe both. Tom swallowed. You were building yourselves up from nothing. You had your own names, your routines, your peace hard-earned. If I told you the truth, then it would have shattered the floor beneath your feet. I didn't want to steal your healing just to ease my conscience. His voice cracked, and for once he didn't try to hide it. I watched you grow. I watched you laugh again. And every year that passed made it harder to know what to do. The silence became habit. And that silence kept me safe from your questions, from her story, from my own cowardice. He clenched his fists around the mug until the ceramic threatened to snap. But now, seeing how hurt you all are, how confused, maybe silence was never safety. Maybe it was betrayal in disguise. He looked up at Aubrey with tired eyes. I don't regret raising you. I don't regret one damn second of being your father. But I regret robbing you of the right to ask your own questions, to choose whether you wanted to find her or not. He paused, waiting, but she said nothing, her arms crossed as if holding herself together. You deserved that choice, he said finally, and I took it away. The wind shifted, and with it, so did the weight of everything unspoken. She reached out once, he added, barely a whisper. Years ago. She sent a drawing, just one. I hid it. I told myself it was for your sake, but I think I just didn't want to see what you'd feel when you saw it. I was afraid it'd be more love than anger, and that terrified me. He let the words hang in the space between them, heavy and raw. I know I'm not your biological father, but I've always tried to be the man who stayed. And sometimes staying meant lying. Sometimes staying meant failing. He stood slowly, joints creaking like the truth finally settling into bone. I won't make that mistake again. Whatever comes next, whatever you need to ask, to feel, to do, I won't stand in the way. I'm sorry, Aubrey. Truly. And in the darkness, she didn't reach for him. But she didn't walk away either, and maybe for now that was enough. She had never told anyone, not Tom, not her sisters, not even herself, not fully. But there was a memory that clung to the edges of Lila's mind like a corner of a half-torn photograph. It returned now, uninvited, as she sat at her drafting table staring blankly at a page she couldn't bring herself to draw on. She had been 8, maybe 9. It was raining that day, the kind of summer storm that turned sidewalks into mirrors and air into mist. She had gotten separated from the group during a school field trip to the city's art district. She remembered wandering off, fascinated by the splashes of color in gallery windows, the smell of acrylics and turpentine spilling onto the street. That's when she saw her. A woman sitting on the steps of a small, nearly hidden studio, paint on her fingertips, a loose scarf covering her hair like a shield. The woman had looked up startled, as if the world had dropped something precious at her feet. Their eyes had locked. Just for a second. A strange warmth rushed through Lila, not recognition exactly, but a sense of being seen. Not the way adults usually looked at children, not with indulgence or amusement, but with longing, with grief, with love so raw it almost looked like pain. The woman had said nothing at first, only reached into her worn satchel and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. A sketch, quick, simple, but delicate. A little girl holding a sunflower. Do you like flowers? The woman had asked. Lila had nodded. She remembered clutching the drawing to her chest like treasure. The woman had smiled then, but her eyes filled with something else. Keep it safe, all right, she had whispered. Then a teacher's voice had called out Lila's name, distant but sharp. And when she turned back to the woman just like that, she was gone. Lila had kept the drawing for a while, tucked between pages of her sketchbook like a secret, until one day it disappeared. Or maybe someone took it. Or maybe she just lost it during one of their many moves. But she never forgot the way that woman looked at her. Years passed, and that memory faded like ink in sunlight. Until now. Until the recent chaos, the revelations, the unraveling of everything she thought she knew about her past. Lila felt the edges of that day resurface with terrifying clarity. She remembered the smell of the woman's scarf jasmine and something older like memory. She remembered the way her fingers trembled just slightly as she handed over the paper. She remembered the eyes. And now, looking at the photograph of Elena Carter that the media had plastered across every screen, every headline, every uncomfortable silence in their household, Lila's breath caught. It was her, the woman on the steps, the sketch, the silence that had screamed love. She had met her mother. She had met her, spoken to her, been held in her gaze like something sacred and hadn't known. She hadn't seen it. Because how could a child look at a stranger and think, this is where I come from? And yet her heart had known. That was the ache, wasn't it? The reason she'd cried that night without understanding why. The reason she'd stopped drawing sunflowers for years afterward. Lila now felt the full weight of that missed connection settle in her chest. She'd spent so long blaming Elena for absence, for silence, but now she realized absence hadn't always been passive. Sometimes it came wrapped in moments too delicate to name. Sometimes it arrived trembling and quiet in the form of a sketch handed to a lost girl. And now the loss had come full circle like a note forgotten in a drawer. She didn't know whether to scream or sob. But she did know one thing: Elena hadn't vanished completely. She had tried. Maybe not enough. Maybe not clearly. But that moment had been real. That drawing had meant something. And now Lila finally knew who had given it to her, and what it had always tried to say. The room smelled of dry watercolor cheap crayons and the faint metallic tang of rusted window frames that let in thin bands of late afternoon light, casting a honey gold glow across the chipped linoleum floor where a dozen little feet shuffled restlessly. Elena sat on the small wooden stool at the center of the classroom, her back hunched ever so slightly, not out of age, but from the invisible weight she had carried for 17 years. Around her, the children of the city's forgotten pressed paint-stained fingers to their paper, some with quiet purpose, others with chaotic abandon, but none with the fear that had once choked her daughter's entry into this world. She hadn't told anyone her real name here. To them she was Miss Nora, the quiet woman with soft eyes and trembling hands who taught them how to shade light into shadows and turn silence into form. It had started as a one-time offer, a desperate attempt to atone without asking forgiveness. But now it had become the only place where her presence felt earned. Elena watched a boy in the corner scribble a crooked sun into a sky the color of bruises, and her chest ached at the truth of it. These were children born into abandonment, not by choice, but by systems, by shame, by parents who had been broken before they'd learned to love. She didn't speak much during the lessons. Instead, she demonstrated letting her brush trace soft lines on paper, drawing small birds, open doors, pairs of shoes left waiting, all symbols she hoped their subconscious would recognize as invitations to hope. Sometimes the kids asked her, "Why don't you have your own kids?" And she'd smile without showing teeth, answering only, "I wasn't ready then, but I'm ready to care now." They always seemed to accept that, as children do, without digging. But one girl, the new one, had sat near her last Saturday and said, "You draw eyes like you miss someone." Elena had frozen mid-stroke. The child had gone back to her painting like she hadn't just pierced something raw. And now today, Elena sat again among them, tracing outlines with a piece of charcoal that left streaks on her palms. She wore no jewelry, no perfume, nothing that tied her to the glamorous identity she'd once been pushed into. She wore simplicity as penance and silence as prayer. Every child here reminded her of a ghost she had once birthed, but not held. Every small laugh, every "look what I made," echoed the voices she had never gotten to hear growing up. She didn't ask about their stories. That was the rule she set for herself. No questions, only presence. She didn't want their trust as currency for her own redemption. She only wanted to be useful. And yet, as she watched a girl with dark curls carefully copy her sketch of a house with an open window, she felt the burn of memory rush up her throat. Lila used to draw windows too. All three of them had each in their own way, even as babies. Elena had only held them once, or maybe not even that. She couldn't be sure anymore. Time and trauma blur like spilled paint. But what she did know with painful clarity was that those girls were out there living lives she didn't shape, speaking words. She didn't teach, facing storms she hadn't stood in front of. And so she taught here in this battered classroom with broken chairs and second-hand paints, believing somehow that every gentle correction of a brushstroke, every quiet nod of approval was one small stone laid in the path, back to something, maybe not forgiveness, maybe not reunion, but dignity. She didn't know if they'd ever come. She didn't know if they'd even remember. But still, every Saturday she came back, mixing color with breath-holding space, with her silence drawing, with the fragile hope that love, even when lost, could leave behind something more than just an ache. Maybe it could leave art. Maybe that would be enough. She didn't hear the door open, just the faint change in the air behind her like a breath being held. Elena's hand was still on the charcoal stick, slowly sketching the outline of a girl's face into the corner of the canvas in front of her, though her mind had drifted miles away back into memory, into regrets that had no expiry. The children were unusually quiet this afternoon, as if the entire room sensed something unspoken had arrived. Her back was to the entrance, her attention split between the paper and the rhythm of her breathing, which she'd learned to keep steady, even when the past crept up behind her. It wasn't until she noticed that the students had stopped drawing, that the scrape of pencils had been replaced by complete stillness, that she paused. Her hand hovered midair, not yet knowing why. And then she felt it. Not a sound, not a touch, but the unmistakable gravity of presence of three bodies standing just behind her, close enough to alter the atmosphere but not close enough to speak. Slowly, as if turning too fast might break whatever spell had summoned this moment, Elena placed the charcoal down and turned. They were there, standing in the golden wash of light pouring through the cracked window like something out of a fever dream. Three figures, young women radiant in their stillness, their elegance muted only by the storm in their eyes. Madison, Lila, Aubrey. She knew them immediately, not because of resemblance, though it was there achingly so, but because some primal part of her had memorized them before memory ever had a chance to fade. Her breath caught in her chest, not quite gasping, not quite crying, just suspended. They didn't speak, neither did she. The space between them was too crowded with everything that had never been said, the years, the absences, the questions, the answers too late to matter. No one moved, no one smiled. But they didn't leave. And that in itself felt like a kind of mercy. Elena's hands trembled slightly at her sides. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words felt too small, too clumsy. What language could possibly carry the weight of 17 years of silence? Instead, she let her eyes do what her voice could not. She looked at each of them with the full force of her longing, her sorrow, her awe. They had grown. They had survived. Without her. And yet here they were. Madison's arms were crossed, her expression unreadable, but not entirely closed. Lila clutched something in her hands, a sketchbook perhaps, and her eyes flickered between the floor and Elena's face, unsure where to rest. Aubrey stood slightly behind the others, her presence quiet but solid like a pillar that didn't need attention to hold weight. For a moment time folded in on itself. Elena was back in that hospital room, hearing their cries for the first time. She was in her kitchen writing letters that no one answered. She was in this very room teaching orphaned children how to draw hope into paper. And now she was here facing the impossible, the return of what she had lost. A child nearby tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Nora, is that your family?" The little girl whispered, her voice cutting through the fog. Elena didn't answer. She didn't have to. Because in the stillness that followed in the breath before the world began to turn again, one of the girls, Lila, maybe stepped forward. Just one step. But it was enough. It broke the distance. It cracked the silence. And though no one spoke, though the classroom remained hushed, and the sun continued to slide across the worn wooden floor, Elena felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of something braver, a willingness to be seen, to be acknowledged, to maybe one day be reclaimed. And as the afternoon light bathed them all in gold, Elena stood in the middle of the room, surrounded not by judgment, but by the ghost of possibility. Of course. Here is a 661-word continuous paragraph for Chapter 6, Idea 3, focusing on the powerful wordless moment where one of the daughters silently sits beside Elena and their hands touch without any dialogue, only emotion, presence, and gesture carrying the scene. She did not expect movement, not so soon, not when the space between them still buzzed with 17 years of absence and the sting of everything unspoken. Elena remained seated motionless, as if any sudden gesture might scatter the fragile quiet like birds startled into flight. The children in the classroom had returned to their drawings occasionally, glancing at the women who had entered like phantoms, but the room still pulsed with a strange, hushed gravity. Elena didn't dare turn her head again. Instead, she stared ahead, eyes fixed on the chalk-smudged wall, breath shallow. Then, from the edge of her vision, she noticed the faintest rustle of movement, a figure breaking away from the trio. No sound, just the hush of careful steps. One of them was walking toward her. Elena's spine straightened unconsciously, every nerve alert, not with fear, but with a stunned kind of reverence. The young woman now moved slowly, deliberately, without looking around for approval or permission. Her shoes whispered against the floor. The room around them remained still, and then, without announcement, without hesitation, she pulled out the empty chair beside Elena's. The same chair Elena had placed there every week, not for a student, but for something she had no name, for regret, hope, memory, longing. It had always stayed unoccupied. Until now. The girl sat, no dramatic pause, no shift in the air, just a quiet settling, like a leaf choosing where to land. Elena didn't turn to look. She couldn't. Instead, she let her senses speak for her, the gentle creak of the chair's legs, the warmth that suddenly bloomed beside her, the slow anchoring realization that someone she once held as a newborn now breathed inches away. The air between them felt impossibly full and impossibly thin. Her fingers resting on the table's edge twitched slightly. She didn't mean to move them, but they did, trembling, hesitant. And then something else moved. A hand. The girl's. It came into view at the edge of Elena's peripheral vision, not reaching, not demanding, simply existing beside hers. Their hands lay there close, but not yet touching, like two islands across a silent sea. Elena closed her eyes. Just for a second. And when she opened them again, the girl's fingers had shifted, barely a breath of space now between them. And then contact. No pressure. Just a single point of warmth, where skin met skin, like a question asked without words and an answer whispered in return. Elena's throat clenched. Her eyes did not tear up. Not yet. But her chest hurt in a way that felt holy, the kind of pain that only comes from being seen, really seen, after being invisible for too long. Still, neither of them spoke. The girl didn't look at her. Elena didn't move. But in that shared silence, louder than any confession, louder than any apology, something passed between them. Not forgiveness. Not quite. But recognition. The kind that stretches backward in time to cradle the child that was lost and forward to meet the woman now grown. Around them, the world went on, the children's pencils scratching paper, the faint hum of traffic outside, the dust motes swirling in sunbeams. But in that chair, in that sliver of space, two lifelines touched again. It wasn't a reunion. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't enough. But it was something. A beginning. A heartbeat shared in silence. Elena didn't dare grip the hand beside hers. She let it rest gently, like a feather that might float away if disturbed. And though she said nothing, though the room remained hushed, she knew something had changed. One of them had sat down. One of them had stayed. And for the first time in 17 years, Elena didn't feel like a ghost anymore. She felt real, flawed, broken, but real. And for now, that was everything. The light had shifted by the time the art class emptied. The late afternoon sun had mellowed into a golden haze, casting long, warm shadows across the linoleum floor. The window panes glowed with amber like stained glass, capturing the hush of something sacred. Outside, the wind stirred gently, rustling the sparse leaves of the trees that lined the quiet yard, brushing against the windows in a rhythm as steady and tender as a mother's breath. Elena remained seated in the same spot, though the paintbrushes had long since been rinsed and the children had gone. The easels stood like quiet sentinels, still holding incomplete sketches, castles drawn by small hand-stick figures with bright eyes, rainbows with too many colors. Across from her, the three girls remained, no longer strangers, no longer unreachable. They didn't speak, not yet. But their silence was full, not hollow, a silence dense with everything that had not been said, but had finally been heard. The girl who had sat beside her, whose fingers had brushed her own in that trembling moment of almost recognition, was still there. Now her hand rested openly on the table, no longer tentative. Elena didn't clutch it. She simply let hers remain near a quiet promise that she would never pull away again. One of the other girls stood by the window, watching the sun fold gently into the horizon. The third, the quietest, had taken one of the children's discarded crayons and was absent-mindedly drawing on the back of a spare sheet of paper. None of them had cried. And yet Elena felt as if every tear she had never shed had been quietly released into the room, absorbed into the floor, the furniture, the air. The pain was still there. So was the distance. But now there was also something else, presence. An almost forgiveness not born from grand apologies or sweeping declarations, but from small acts of staying. The light outside grew softer, bathing the room in a golden pink hue like a dream that knew it must end but didn't want to yet. A breeze slipped through the cracked window and toyed with a few strands of Elena's hair, lifting them briefly before letting them fall. She exhaled slowly, as if breathing for the first time in years. There were no dramatic embraces, no promises of starting over. Just four women in a quiet room surrounded by chalk dust and sunlight, finding a way to share the same space without breaking. A tiny bird landed on the windowsill, tilting its head curiously before darting away into the glowing dusk. The moment was so simple it almost hurt. But sometimes healing doesn't arrive with noise. It comes like this, with wind brushing skin, with eyes meeting, and looking away again with hands not pulled back. Elena turned her head slowly, allowing herself to take them in the daughters she had lost, and somehow not entirely lost. She memorized their faces, each detail more vivid than any painting she had ever made. And when one of them finally looked back at her, not with certainty but without anger, Elena felt a shift inside her. Not redemption, not yet, but possibility. Outside, the world went on cars, past, leaves fell. The sky deepened into a quiet violet. But in that small classroom suspended in time, something had changed. The wind carried it through the cracks in the walls, through the pages of abandoned sketchbooks, through the still air between words unsaid. Elena closed her eyes and whispered a thank you, not to them, not out loud, but to the moment itself, for letting her stay, for letting her be seen. And when she opened her eyes again, the room was still full, not of certainty, but of hope. And for now, that was enough. In life, we are taught to measure love by presence, by consistency, by who stays when things fall apart. But what happens when someone who should have stayed leaves and years later dares to return, not with excuses, but with humility and quiet hope? Elena's story is not one of dramatic redemption, but of subtle repair. It is a reminder that love, while fragile, is not always broken beyond repair, and that forgiveness, though never owed, can sometimes bloom in the quiet spaces where pain and longing coexist. In our own lives, many of us carry wounds from absences we cannot explain, from people who vanished when we needed them most. And sometimes we are the ones who walked away out of fear, shame, or the false belief that someone else would love better. But what this story teaches us is that healing is not about erasing the past. It's about showing up trembling but true and saying, I'm still here. It's about the hand that doesn't pull away the silence that's filled with understanding, and the empty chair that waits, not because it must, but because someone still believes in hope. If you've been hurt by someone's absence, know that your pain is real, and you don't have to forgive before you're ready. And if you're someone seeking to return, remember, it's not the words that matter most. It's what you do after the silence. The world won't always give us second chances, but we can choose to give them to each other quietly, gently, one moment at a time. If this story stirred something in you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced someone who returned after years, or been that person yourself? Save this video so you can revisit it on days when forgiveness feels far away. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reflect the complicated, beautiful, and very human journey we're all on. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us we're not alone.